Good morning. It is great to see everyone here this morning. Great to sing together, pray together, remember our Lord's sacrifice and the Lord's Supper. It's just a pleasure to be together and to worship. You know, words really are one of the most fascinating things in the entire world. Words only have the value that we assign them. There's so many different languages throughout the world, throughout history, and each of them compiled of letters, of words that the only value they have is that which we give them. Words are only valuable if they are understood. And you know, words and phrases, even within our own language, take different meanings across time and place. If you were to read any kind of literature from older times, say 100, maybe more years ago in English, you'd find that the vocabulary, the way that words are used, is very different. Things that we say today don't even mean perhaps what they did 50 years ago. And as we look at this, sometimes we might think of different phrases and words in the modern day that maybe we don't even understand at all because they're so new. Even as we think about different places in the world, we see this. Take our southern sayings, for example. Don't we have a lot of things that we say here in the southeastern United States that really they're combinations of words that don't make any sense at all if you stop to think about them, but we know what they mean. For instance, take the phrase, do what? You know, when we hear that, we might think somebody's saying, what is it that I'm supposed to do? Do what? But where I'm from, growing up all my life, if you didn't hear someone in a conversation, you said, now do what? You know, if you had a conversation with someone who wasn't from around here, and they said something and you didn't understand them or you didn't hear them right, you might say, now do what? And they wouldn't have a clue what you were talking about. Well, I didn't tell you to do anything. What do you mean, do what? No, I just didn't hear you. Do what? I think perhaps if we turn to Joshua chapter 6, Joshua himself, the leader of Israel, in conversation with God, might have had one of these do what moments. God, do what? Maybe I didn't hear you right. Maybe I didn't understand what you were asking me to do. Joshua chapter 6 is a very pivotal moment in the history of Israel. Let's set the stage here for a moment. What's happening? Well, as we get to Joshua chapter 6 and we look at the preceding chapters, we find that they are at a very key time. The generation that came out of Egypt and came almost into the promised land, just to the border before those 10 spies brought that bad report. We remember that from the earlier books of the Bible. All that generation, as punishment for their unfaithfulness, has now died. A new generation of Israelites has risen up, and they are now ready to conquer the promised land. Moses, the leader of Israel, the one who led them out of Egypt, who they had looked to for 40 plus years, who was God's spokesman to them in a very real way, he is now passed. He's dead and gone, and now Joshua has risen up to take his place. Moses, while a leader of the people in kind of their nomadic lifestyle while in the wilderness, we might think of Moses maybe as more of a peaceful leader, though they fought many battles during that time. But Joshua is a military leader. Joshua is a man who is strong and who is the perfect candidate for this conquering people. In Joshua chapter 3, we find the people finally crossing over the Jordan River, stepping foot into the promised land for the first time. And now, as we reach Joshua chapter 6, we see them begin to fulfill their task of conquering the land. The land is inhabited by many different people, many different enemies that they would have to face. And their job from God was simple: conquer everything. He had promised to give the land into their hands. And so in Joshua chapter 6, we find them approaching their first target, the city of Jericho. Now, we might think if you were kind of this ragtag group of people that we kind of think about the Israelites being, though they were very strong militarily and there were many of them, you might think you might want to go for kind of a soft target to start with. Take out some of the smaller cities and then we're going to take out the bigger ones as we go along, get some wins under the belt beforehand. But that's not what they do. That was not God's or their strategy for conquering the promised land at all. No, Jericho, the first city that they attempt to conquer, is one of the biggest, the strongest, the most well-protected and fortified, established cities in all of the land. They didn't start with an easy target. When Israel came into the promised land, they began with a statement. In Joshua chapter 2, we see before they cross over the Jordan that Joshua sends spies to go and do some reconnaissance on Jericho. That account, we remember, famous for Rahab, who hid the spies when they were in the city. During the Bible study hour here in the auditorium, we're going to talk more about that story. So there's a little preview for you, if you will. But we learn from this conversation, this time that these spies spend with Rahab, that Jericho is not unaware of what's about to happen. They know that they are the first target of Israel, and they are afraid. Rahab says, the people melt before the children of Israel. Jericho's heard about these people who a little over 40 years prior had left Egypt as a slave nation. They had busted out of Egypt with those famous 10 plagues. They had heard about the parting of the Red Sea. They had heard about the different battles they have fought during their time in the wilderness. And Jericho, they're fearful. They are afraid of Israel. And so we see that Israel has what we might call the mental advantage here. They've already got the upper hand before they ever step foot near the city of Jericho. However, they're attacking. Israel is the attacking force, and Jericho is built for defense. That would have been their strong suit. We, of course, know and will read about here momentarily the walls of Jericho, the famous walls of Jericho. The archaeological evidence from this particular city tells us that the walls were likely large retaining stones at the bottom, as we kind of think about it. These big, huge chunks of stone would have made up the base of the wall, and then as you went up, it would have probably been something like mud bricks as you got towards the top. This wall, while we might not think about it as big for modern day standards, for that time would have been very imposing, likely between 20 and 25 feet tall most of the way around somewhere between 15 and 20 feet thick. That's a big wall. Maybe not by military standards today, but in the ancient times when they were moving those stones and those bricks with their hands with just manpower, this is an imposing defense. And alongside the wall, there's archaeological evidence saying that there were defensive ramparts that had been within the city walls, these places from which Jericho could easily defend off any kind of invasion. So Jericho is built for defense. How is it that Israel is going to attack? How are they going to go in and conquer this defensive juggernaut? They've got their work cut out for them. And so the stage is set. And we read in Joshua chapter 6 and verse 1, "Now Jericho was shut up inside and outside because of the people of Israel. None went out and none came in." So we have this picture of Jericho. They're completely enclosed. No one going out, no one coming in. They're ready for defense. They're ready for Israel's siege, and they aren't going to back down. They're not going to give in, but Israel is waiting and ready. Now, though Joshua is the leader of Israel, we know who's really in charge. It's God. If Joshua is the commander of the army, we might think of God as the general. He's the king of these people and of this operation. And in Joshua chapter 6, verses 2 through 5, we see the instructions, the orders that God gives as to how Israel is going to conquer the city. Begin reading with me here in verse 2 of Joshua chapter 6. And the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand, with its king and mighty men of valor. You shall march around the city, all the men of war, going around the city once. Thus shall you do for 6 days. 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark. On the 7th day you shall march around the city 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. And when they make a long blast with the ram's horn, when you hear the sound of the trumpet, then all the people shall shout with a great shout, and the walls of the city will fall down flat, and the people shall go up, everyone straight before him." You know, in verse 2, God starts out with an assurance to Joshua. He says, "Joshua, I've given this city into your hands. You are going to win. You're going to have victory. I guarantee it." And we have to think, maybe Joshua at the time is thinking, yeah, that's great. God's going to give us victory. All right, God, how are we going to do it? Or what amazing military strategy do you have for us, Lord, that we're going to conquer this great defensive city? And God says, well, for the first 6 days, you're going to march around the city. Okay, we're going to march around the city, and what? No, that's it. You're just going to march around the city, just once, for 6 days. We might think maybe Joshua in this situation is thinking, what? We're going to do what? We're just going to march around the city. That's it? Now, God, surely there's got to be something more. Oh, there is, Joshua. Don't worry. You're also going to have 7 priests with 7 trumpets. Okay, what are they going to do? They're just going to blow the trumpet. Okay. You know, that's good, Lord, but what else are we going to do? Well, the 7th day, Joshua, then you're going to march around the city 7 times. Okay. And then they're going to blow the trumpet again, and you're going to shout. We have to think maybe at this time Joshua's thinking, now, Lord, you know, I've seen you do great things, but I'm not really sure exactly how this strategy is going to all come together. And there at the end, we see God tells him what? When these things happen, when you march around the city, when you blow the trumpet, when the people yell, the wall is going to fall down flat, and the city is going to be given into your hands. Just think about, if this plan works, the shock that will be upon the people of Jericho. Their walls, that's what they're relying on. Their defense. They're thinking, you know, these walls, if they're not going to win us a victory, they're at least going to buy us the time we need to escape. But if the walls fall down, well, that's the end for Jericho. And that's exactly the plan that God has in place. But what do you think Joshua is thinking after this conversation with the Lord? You think he's a bit confused? Perhaps skeptical? Maybe he wanted to argue and say, now God, you know, I trust you, Lord, but maybe we just pivot to a little bit of a different plan, something more convenient, maybe something more standard. After all, no military leader in all of history would look at this plan and say, yep, that's got my stamp of approval. That's exactly what we need to do to conquer this city. Well, whatever Joshua's personal thoughts were, he shows his faith in God, because what does he do? He doesn't make any argument. He doesn't complain. He doesn't think he knows a better way. No, what's he do? He gives immediate obedience. Joshua, without hesitation, relays the orders to the people and prepares for this very unique siege of the city. Continue reading with me in verse 6. So Joshua, the son of Nun, called the priest and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant, and let 7 priests bear 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord." And he said to the people, "Go forward, March around the city and let the armed men pass on before the ark of the Lord. And just as Joshua commanded the people, the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the Lord went forward, blowing the trumpets with the ark of the covenant of the Lord following them. The armed men were walking before the priests who were blowing the trumpets, and the rear guard was walking after the ark while the trumpets blew continually. But Joshua commanded the people, "You shall not shout or make noise with your mouth until the day I tell you to shout. Then you shall shout." So he caused the ark of the Lord to circle the city, going about at once, and they came into the camp and spent the night in the camp. Joshua, as he's relaying these orders to the people, makes careful note of every detail as he conveys the plan. No detail is left out, and it's not only the details that they have to explicitly follow, he also makes note of the things that they have to avoid. Notice how he says, for the first 6 days, as we go around the city, we have to be quiet. It's not time to shout yet. That's not what the Lord commanded. He said on the 7th day, after the trumpet blows, that's when the people are to shout. So for those first 6 days, there has to be silence. Joshua's obedience is immediate, detail-oriented, and complete. And so we see that he executes the plan that God has given him, carries it out to perfection. Continue reading in verse 12. Then Joshua rose early in the morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. And the 7 priests bearing the 7 trumpets of ram's horns before the ark of the Lord walked on, and they blew the trumpets continually, and the armed men were walking before them, and the rear guard was walking after the ark of the Lord while the trumpets blew continually. And the 2nd day they marched around the city once and returned into the camp. So they did for 6 days. On the 7th day they rose early at the dawn of day and marched around the city in the same manner 7 times. It was only on that day that they marched around the city 7 times. And at the 7th time, when the priest had blown the trumpets, Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city, and the city and all that is within it shall be devoted to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall live, because she hid the messengers whom I sent. But you keep yourselves from the things devoted to destruction, lest when you have devoted them, you take any of the devoted things and make the camp of Israel a thing for destruction and bring trouble upon it. But all silver and gold and every vessel of bronze and iron are holy to the Lord. They shall go into the treasury of the Lord." I find it very interesting, the detail in verse 12 and verse 15 that tells us they rose early to accomplish what the Lord had set before them. They rose early. This is not me advocating for being a morning person. I am by no means myself a morning person. I don't think that's what this is trying to convey. But what it conveys is there's priority here. The people aren't waking up and, having a nice slow start to the day, and whenever they get around to it, I guess we'll walk around the city. No, this is the first thing they do. They make a priority of accomplishing what God has set before them to do. Joshua, as they're going around the city on day 7, he gives them one last set of instructions before they give that shout, which will bring the walls down, in verses 16 through 19. He gives them one last set of instructions. He says, we're supposed to spare Rahab. We see that, of course, from chapter 2, because of her kindness, her faithfulness in sparing the spies and hiding them when the men of the city came looking. But they're to devote everything else to destruction. Everything. To destroy it completely and totally. Except for those things of silver, of gold, of bronze, of iron. Those things are to be given to the Lord. This is interesting because it's unusual. Normally, if you're a conquering people If you're going into a place of considerable wealth, of considerable economic advantage, what do you want to do? Well, you want to take all of their stuff and make it your stuff. That would be the standard practice, but God says, no, destroy it all. Every single bit of it, destroy it. Why? This command to destroy everything except for those things saved for the Lord's service is to show Israel who's giving the victory, to show them who is in control, and it's God. Think about how Israel might have boasted in the things that they would gain. After conquering Jericho, they might say, well, we've got all this stuff now. We've got this empty city that we might just live in ourselves, and why conquer the rest of the promised land? This is probably good enough, right? We did this. What a great victory we had. No, that's not the point. God is the one giving the victory. The things taken, the spoils, are to go directly to His service. Israel is to gain really no advantage from this particular victory. Israel is under God's service, serving Him, giving Him the glory. And that's what they have to be reminded of by these kinds of commands. So we see the orders, we see the obedience, we see the execution. What's the result? Does it work? Continue reading verse 20. So the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown. As soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they captured the city. Then they devoted all in the city to destruction, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys, with the edge of the sword. Against the laws of physics, against all reason that normally we would think about, this plan from God works just as He promised that it would. Sometimes we're tempted to overlook some interesting details within the text. But when it says that the people went up into the city, we might kind of just skim over that and say, well, that's, a weird way to say that, but not very important. It's actually very interesting that how it pairs with the archaeological evidence of the time. You see, what we find as we have dug out the destruction layers, they're called, of the place of Jericho, is that when the walls fell, they most likely fell outward, creating a kind of natural ramp up into the city for Israel to use. And so when it says they went up into the city, it literally means they went up into the city, giving them already yet another natural advantage of high ground as they come in to take the city. Imagine being a citizen of Jericho when the walls fell. Imagine the fear that they are experiencing. They have this enemy who now for 7 days, all they've done is look over the walls and see them marching around in circles, blowing horns. Maybe they're even thinking, these people are crazy. They may never even take the city. They're not even going to attack us. They're insane. And then you hear this shout and the walls fall and the city is destroyed. The walls fall not because of any physical reason, but because of the very hand of God. The plan made no sense. If we look at it strictly from a physical standpoint, the plan made no sense. But when God is in control, His plans always lead to the intended effect. God's people win because they are on His side. What's the point of all this, though? How does this apply to us today? We're commanded to be active in spiritual warfare, but we're not really conquering any armed cities that I'm aware of in a physical sense. How does this apply to us? Are there times in our lives, when we doubt God's plan, when we're tempted to question. Maybe there are times when we even doubt that he has a plan at all. Don't you think when Joshua heard this plan, he may have been tempting for him to say, now God, are you just making this up as we go? Did you just come up with this as we were sitting here? Sometimes that's kind of how we think about the plans of God. But let's not be foolish, and let's remember, number one, God has a plan. He's got plans for us. Jeremiah chapter 29 and verse 11, perhaps the most common verse that we cite when thinking about this. Jeremiah writes, God says, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. As we think about the context even of this very verse, Jeremiah is writing to the people of Israel as they are under Babylonian persecution. Their city of Jerusalem is being destroyed. And what does God say even in that time of crisis for them? There is a plan. I have a plan for you, and even though everything looks bad now, that plan is good. It's not for evil, it's for the future, and it's for hope. If we think about Isaiah chapter 46, verses 9 and 10, it says, I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times, things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all of my purposes. Isaiah reminds us this incredible fact about the nature of God. God is timeless, outside of time, not bound by it. From eternity, he has made his decisions. He declares the end from the beginning, not just the end and the beginning of our lives, of the things within our lives, the end and the beginning of all things and of all time. He has a plan, and his plan is good, and his purposes will be accomplished. We like to have our plans. We like to make plans and attempt to stick to them. We like to think that we know the way that things are going to go. We most often think we know the way things should go. That's for certain. But we need to remember what the Proverbs writer says. In Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 9, he says, the heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. And then 3 chapters later in Proverbs 19 and verse 21, he says, many are the plans of the mind of man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. These verses remind us of this fact that, yes, we make plans. We have plans. Plans are good. It's certainly better to have a plan than to try and wing everything and just hope it works out. But when our plans don't go the way we think they should, when things seem to get sideways and we think, why in the world is it happening like this? Let's not be so quick to jump to any conclusions, but slow down and think just for a moment that God, he's in control. He's the one establishing our steps. His will is what will stand in the end. Often we're faced with this thought, man, this isn't going how I planned. This isn't going the way I wanted it to. This isn't going how I think it should. We're faced with these kinds of thoughts and struggles all the time. Imagine, just for a moment, if we could have a direct conversation with God about his plans. What would we do? If we could just sit down one-on-one with the Lord and say, God, what's your plan for me? How is all of this going to work out and come together? Do you think if we had that opportunity that we'd be tempted to argue? That we would be tempted to disagree? To try and some way haggle with God and say, now, Lord, that plan, it's all right, but I think my plan's a little better. I think I want it to work out this way instead. Would we be tempted to say what Joshua could have said? Lord, do what? Lord, I'm going to have to endure what struggle? God, I'm going to be given what uncomfortable situation? I'm going to be faced with what diagnosis? I'm going to be faced with a move? That project? That's the one that's going to fall through, Lord? God, are you sure? Are you sure? You know, in the Bible, there is a man who gets to have this kind of conversation with God. His name was Job. If we remember the book of Job, we know things really aren't going right for Job. He's lost everything. He's lost his children and his wealth and his health all in one day. His friends have turned on him, given him bad advice, and he's really just at the very bottom. He's reached rock bottom, as we say. And at this time, he basically says, God, I want an audience with you, and God grants his request. And in that conversation, God reminds Job of who's in control. God asked Job, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Job, everything, the entire world is held up by my power. It was all created by my voice. God reminds Job of his omnipotent nature, his all-powerful existence. And as God and Job have this discourse back and forth, God never tells Job what's actually happening. We have the advantage of having the scriptures. We can look back to Job chapter 1 and see that all of this trial and struggle that Job is going through is because Satan is testing him, seeing if his faith is true and genuine. But Job never knows that. God never tells him. And at the end of this entire multi-chapter discourse that Job and the Lord have, it comes down to it, and God basically says, Job, don't worry about it. Job wants to know the plan. He wants to know what's happening. He wants to know why. And God tells him, it's not for you to know. It's not for you to know, Job. Don't worry about it. God doesn't tell him that this is all happening because of Satan. He doesn't tell him that he's going to be blessed again and receive back all of his wealth and more. No. God simply tells him it's not his concern to know. God was in control. He had a plan, just like Jericho and just like our lives. God gave Israel the most improbable victory that we could think of. And God promises us that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his promise. Romans chapter 8, verse 28. Not all things will be good. There will be struggle and trial and pain, but they'll work out for good. Because God's in control, God has a plan, and that plan is for good. God does not make empty promises. He is in control. This morning, if you're not a Christian, God's plan for your life must start with your obedience to him. Would you this morning leave the world behind and the sin that's in it, become a member of the church, of God's family, receive the gift of eternal salvation promised in Jesus? If you're ready to take the steps necessary to become God's child this morning, behind me is water. What hinders you from being baptized? But this morning for us as Christians, those who have died to the old and are claiming to live for the new, do we trust in God? Do we truly have faith in and trust in the plans of the one that we say we are serving? Trust is hard. It is, especially when we may not always know the plan. But we know the one who has the plan. We know the one who made the plan, and he'll never steer us wrong. Do you have that faith and that trust in God this morning, or does it need to be rekindled in your heart? Do you need to make the conscious effort to pursue that trust and faith in Him again. You know, a response to the invitation doesn't always involve coming to the front pew. We all make a response. We all decide how we're going to live from here on out. How will you respond this morning? If you have any need, please make it known as we stand and sing together.